At first glance, this case looked ordinary. A quiet town, a routine police response, a set of facts that appeared clean, clear, and easily explainable. But as investigators would later discover, nothing about this case stayed simple for long. The call came in just after dawn, a report of something not right at a property on the edge of town. No signs of forced entry, no active threat, just a lingering sense that something didn't belong. When officers arrived, they found a scene that felt staged by routine rather than chaos. Doors unlocked, personal items untouched, no obvious struggle, no immediate explanation. On paper, it looked like an open and shut situation, but seasoned investigators know something most people don't. The most dangerous cases are the ones that look solved too quickly. As evidence was collected and logged, small inconsistencies began to surface. Times didn't align, statements overlapped in strange ways, physical details contradicted witness recollections. None of it was dramatic on its own, but together it formed a pattern investigators couldn't ignore. This wasn't a case with missing evidence. It was a case with too much evidence pointing in different directions. And from that moment on, the investigation shifted from finding answers to asking a far more troubling question. What if the truth had been buried under assumptions from the very beginning? The town would soon learn that the evidence everyone trusted was the very thing leading them astray. In every investigation, the first conclusions matter more than most people realize. They shape the questions that get asked, they influence which leads are followed and which are quietly set aside. In this case, early assumptions began forming almost immediately. Because there were no obvious signs of forced entry, investigators leaned toward familiarity, someone known to the scene, someone who belonged there. That assumption alone narrowed the scope before the real work had even begun. Witness interviews followed a predictable pattern. Neighbors described routine behavior, familiar faces, normal schedules. Nothing alarming, nothing urgent. And yet, buried inside those statements were subtle inconsistencies that didn't raise alarms at first. One witness mentioned a time that didn't match another's account. Another recalled seeing lights on when official records suggested the building should have been empty. A third offered details that seemed oddly rehearsed, though not suspicious enough to challenge outright. Individually, none of this mattered. Together, it should have. But early on, the investigation was moving quickly, perhaps too quickly. Evidence was being organized to fit a working theory instead of being allowed to challenge it. This is where quiet errors happen. Not through negligence, not through malice, but through confidence. Investigators trusted the logic of the scene. They trusted the timelines as they appeared. They trusted that what looked normal was normal. Meanwhile, physical evidence told a different story. Objects were positioned too neatly. Certain items showed signs of recent use that didn't align with reported times. And one particular detail, small, easily overlooked, didn't belong at all. It was documented, photographed, logged, then mentally dismissed because it didn't fit. As the days passed, the case progressed under the weight of its own momentum. Paperwork moved forward, reports were finalized, the narrative settled into place. But beneath that surface calm, something was wrong. Veteran detectives often say that when a case feels finished too early, it rarely is. And this one had already begun drifting away from the truth, quietly, steadily, guided by assumptions no one thought to question. Timelines are supposed to bring order to chaos. They tell investigators where people were, when events happened, and how one moment connects to the next. In this case, the timeline appeared solid at first glance, clean, organized, believable. But when it was examined closely, it began to bend. The first crack appeared during a routine review of call logs and access records. A timestamp didn't match a witness statement. At first, it was blamed on a clerical delay. Then another discrepancy appeared, then another. Each difference was small, minutes, not hours, easy to explain away, easy to ignore. But patterns don't need to be loud to be dangerous. One investigator, newer to the department and less invested in the original conclusions, began asking uncomfortable questions. Why did a key action occur before it was supposedly authorized? Why did a door log show activity during a period when the building was meant to be empty? When those questions were raised, the response was calm but firm. The system probably lagged. Memory isn't perfect. These things happen. They do, until they happen too often. When the timeline was reconstructed from scratch, without assumptions, the sequence no longer aligned. Events overlapped when they shouldn't have, gaps appeared where activity was expected, and one crucial moment seemed to exist twice depending on which record you trusted. That wasn't an error, that was a warning. The investigation team faced a quiet dilemma. To correct the timeline meant reopening interviews, challenging earlier conclusions, and admitting that something fundamental might have been wrong. And reopening a case doesn't just affect paperwork, it affects reputations. So the timeline was adjusted instead of rebuilt, rounded instead of questioned, smoothed until it made sense again. But the truth doesn't disappear when ignored. It waits. Months later, an external audit, unrelated to the case itself, forced a deeper review of archived digital data. That's when an unaltered backup surfaced. Raw timestamps, untouched entries, original access records. And suddenly, the timeline collapsed. Someone had been present when they shouldn't have been. Something had happened earlier than reported. And one critical action occurred after investigators believed everything was already over. The evidence hadn't changed, only the willingness to see it had. For the first time, the case stopped moving forward and began looking backward.
When cases collapse, it's rarely because evidence disappears. It's because meaning does. In this investigation, the most important pieces had never gone missing. They were logged, cataloged, and stored properly. They sat exactly where they had always been. What changed wasn't the evidence. It was the lens. Once the timeline fell apart, investigators returned to the physical record with fresh eyes. No assumptions, no shortcuts, no pressure to make pieces fit. One item stood out immediately. It had been mentioned in reports, photographed, and then quietly dismissed. Not because it was irrelevant, but because it didn't match what investigators believed the case was about. Now it was impossible to ignore. The item didn't point to motive or identity, it pointed to sequence. It suggested that an action thought to be final wasn't. That single realization reframed everything. Suddenly, earlier contradictions made sense. Witness statements that once seemed unreliable aligned perfectly when placed in the correct order. Actions that appeared suspicious became logical, and actions once considered routine raised new questions. The evidence hadn't lied. The story around it had. Investigators began mapping the case again, not around a suspect, but around behavior. What was done, when it was done, and who benefited from the misunderstanding. That's when the pattern emerged. Not criminal brilliance, not chaos, just convenience. Key decisions had been made at moments when oversight was weakest. Documentation was technically correct, but strategically incomplete. Nothing illegal on its own, but together, it told a story of avoidance. The case hadn't failed because the truth was hidden. It failed because it was uncomfortable. As confidence grew, so did responsibility. This wasn't just about correcting a file. It was about acknowledging that earlier conclusions had been shaped by urgency, pressure, and the desire for closure. And now, closure was no longer acceptable. By the end of the review, investigators weren't chasing theories anymore. They were verifying facts. And for the first time since the investigation began, every verified fact pointed in the same direction. Not toward blame, toward clarity. The question was no longer what happened. It was why it took so long to see it. By the time investigators reached the final phase, the case no longer felt heavy. It felt precise. Every major question had been reduced to verifiable facts. Every disputed moment had been placed correctly in time. What once looked like contradiction now appeared as cause and effect. For the first time since the investigation began, nothing needed to be forced. The final reconstruction was simple.
Not dramatic, not sensational, just accurate. Investigators rebuilt the case step by step, not to prove a theory, but to demonstrate reality. Independent reviews confirmed the findings. External analysts reached the same conclusions without guidance. That's when confidence replaced doubt. The evidence didn't just add up, it spoke clearly. The earlier confusion wasn't the result of deception alone, but of momentum. Decisions made too quickly, conclusions accepted too early, and once those conclusions hardened, everything that didn't fit was quietly pushed aside. Now, nothing was being pushed away. The final report didn't assign blame recklessly. It documented failure honestly, procedural, not personal, and in doing so, it restored integrity to the process. The case was formally resolved, not rewritten, not buried, corrected. For those affected, the outcome brought something rare in long investigations: peace without illusion. The truth wasn't perfect, but it was complete. And for the investigators, the resolution carried a lesson that would shape every case that followed. Evidence doesn't need interpretation before it needs patience. Timelines don't need assumptions to move forward, and the truth doesn't demand speed, only attention. The case that once stood as an example of confusion became a reference point for reform. Training changed, review systems improved, quiet standards were raised. What began as a failure ended as progress, and that is the rarest kind of victory. Not one that closes a file, but one that ensures the next file is handled better.